The Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 1 through 29. Our passage today consists of 3 stories, all of which contain a great deal of human interest. They are subtitled, according to the New Living Translation, Jesus Rejected at Nazareth, How and Why Jesus is Unappreciated and Unaccepted in His Hometown of Nazareth. Jesus sends out the 12 disciples. How and why Jesus has his 12 disciples go out on mission. The death of John the Baptist. How and why John the Baptist is executed in prison. In these stories, we'll note how and why certain people respond and react to Jesus the way they do. We'll observe human nature playing out in the real world of relationships and prejudices. If there is one inescapable theme that runs throughout, it is this one. Opposition. The gospel of Christ and those who share it will often be opposed. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat, I don't like the idea of being attacked or rejected for my faith. I don't like to talk about it, think about it, or anticipate it. I'd rather be liked by the world. My natural tendency is to get along with everyone, not rock the boat or make waves. So I'll emphasize passages like Romans 12:18. As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. But we all have experienced some antagonism for our faith. Some of it is subtle and some of it overt. The Bible tells us that persecution for our faith is inevitable and will increase. The Apostle Paul reminds us, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. This is a 21st century reality. According to the World Evangelical Alliance, over 200 million Christians in at least 60 countries are denied fundamental human rights solely because of their faith. Opposition is the expected consequence of being a Christ follower and a Christ emulator, of being called to illuminate a darkened world. Not acknowledging potential animosity and hostility to our faith leaves us unprepared and unable to do the will of God. As we study our passage today, we will see that there is a cost to discipleship. If there was one place you'd expect Jesus not to face opposition, it would be his hometown of Nazareth. You'd think that there would be a level of openness and comfort there, some 25 miles from Capernaum. Here's an artist's rendition of Nazareth. Nestled among the hills, it seems picturesque and populated. But in Jesus' time, it was tiny. Some estimate that the population was less than 500. It seems that many people looked at Nazareth as out in the sticks, a place of little consequence or import. Even Nathanael, one of the 12, felt that nothing good could come out of Nazareth. You wonder if the Nazarenes also bought into that idea, since they don't seem to be expecting anything good to come out of their little town. After a period of ministry elsewhere, Jesus returns to his old stomping grounds. Everyone knows him there. They know his family, but they know him as an ordinary guy with an unremarkable upbringing. He's had no formal religious training. He's shown no inkling of being anything more than a carpenter, and recently he hasn't even been doing that. He's been away making strange claims, doing surprising things, and getting people to follow him. The townsfolk of Nazareth are quite sure they know Mary's son, and that turns out to be a real problem. Because the people think they know who Jesus really is, they cannot see who Jesus really is. The same problem persists today. For many, Jesus is the gentle figure they learned about in childhood, or the angry and vindictive God of ancient Israel, or a teacher of moral truths that are no longer relevant today, or the figurehead of churches that are exclusionary, judgmental, hypocritical, sometimes corrupt. Even as believers, we can become so familiar with Christ, so casual, that we lose sight of his holiness and sovereignty in our lives. Knowing much about Jesus without obeying him leads to taking him for granted. It is all too easy to make Jesus more palatable to ourselves and others. More often than not, we do this by making Jesus in our own image. It bears repeating. Because people think they know who Jesus really is, they cannot see who Jesus really is. So, in a sense, Nazareth seems to be a closed town, an unfruitful place to spread the good news. Jesus has his disciples go elsewhere. As Jesus sends them out, you might notice some unusual things about how he does it. He sends them out soon. He sends them out in pairs. He sends them out with very little. And he sends them out prepared for both acceptance and rejection. Perhaps the first thing you might notice in Mark's account is how soon Jesus feels they are ready to go out and represent him. From what we know about the disciples so far, this seems premature. Jesus had just gotten through telling them that they were faithless on the Sea of Galilee. Earlier, they did not understand his parables. They've seen Jesus challenged by the religious authorities and rejected by his own family. But they've also seen the miraculous change that happens to people through the power of Christ. They've seen a storm calmed by Christ's command, pigs dashing into the sea, a little girl brought back to life, a voice from God saying, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." But what about their lack of faith? In Luke, the disciples actually bring this issue up themselves. Increase our faith, they say. Jesus essentially tells them they already have enough. It needs only to be small as a mustard seed. Jesus' men need to know that the power of God is available to them as well. The ability and authority to spread the truth of God to others is within them because Jesus has given it to them. Imperfect as they are, they have what it takes to go forth. The mission of Jesus is their mission too. They go in pairs. There are practical reasons for this. Going 2 by 2 would provide mutual support, common counsel, and complementary gifts. It is also symbolic, for the Jews have always maintained that the witness of 2 or more carries legal validity. They are to take almost nothing with them, basically just the clothes on their backs. They will be dependent on others for their needs. They will need to learn humility as well as dependence on God. And people will respond to them, some positively and some negatively. They should stay at any home that welcomes them. Moving from home to home would only cause misunderstanding and dishonor their hosts. And to those who do not welcome them, they will shake the dust off their feet, a symbolic gesture of rejection and warning of judgment to come. Sandwiched within the story of the sending of the 12 is the story of Herod and his wife Herodias. It includes a flashback to the occasion of the death of John the Baptist. Just who was Herod? It can be confusing because the Bible mentions 6 different rulers named Herod, often without specifying which one it is. Let's do a quick review. The original Herod was known as Herod the Great. He ruled in Palestine at the time of the birth of Christ and began the Herodian dynasty. Though he pretended to be a Jew, he came from Idumean and Nabatean ancestry. He was installed as king by Rome because he was a local guy. It is Herod the Great that tried to deceive the Magi and eliminate Jesus by killing young boys in Bethlehem. This forced Joseph, Mary, and Jesus to flee to Egypt. Now, mind you, no Herod had absolute control over Palestine. All the Herods were put in place and given local authority by the Roman Empire. So when Herod the Great died in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided by Rome. These territories were given to 3 of his many sons. They are Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip II. Here is how Israel was divided. Herod Archelaus received half and was called an ethnarch. His territory included Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Herod Antipas was given 1/4, composed of 2 discontinuous regions that included Galilee and Perea. He was called a tetrarch, indicating his rule over 1/4 of the nation. Tetrarch Herod Philip II, Herod had more than one son named Philip, received the northeastern regions bordering Syria. Herod Archelaus was a particularly mean man. When Jesus' family eventually returned to Israel, they settled not in Bethlehem, but farther north in Nazareth to avoid Archelaus' cruelty. The ruler was so vicious that the Romans themselves had to remove him after less than 3 years in office, and in his place install a series of Roman governors, one of whom ended up being Pontius Pilate. Nazareth is located in Galilee, in the region controlled by Herod Antipas. And that brings us to our story today. Antipas is the one who imprisons John the Baptist. Back in chapter 1, Mark told us John was put in prison. That event was somewhat of a marker for the beginning of Christ's ministry. We never found out the details of that imprisonment, but now we do. The saga centers around a woman named Herodias. Originally, she was the wife of Herod. No, not Antipas, but another half-brother named Philip I, who lived in Rome. In fact, she was Philip's niece. One day when Antipas was in Rome, he fell in love with his half-brother's wife and convinced her to divorce Philip and marry him. Now, according to Jewish law, divorce is permitted, but not marrying your brother's wife while he is still alive. That was considered incest, not to mention that Antipas was marrying his half-niece. Nonetheless, that's what he did. This was wrong, and John said exactly that, publicly and probably to his face. That's the real reason John the Baptist was arrested. Though Antipas was likely upset at John's denunciations, he was at the same time fascinated by John. Something within him told him that John was a holy and righteous man, and he liked to listen to his teaching. Herodias, on the other hand, was incensed and could not let her anger go. She wanted John taken out, the sooner the better. But she had to find the right opportunity, since her husband was inclined to protect him. This opportunity came at her husband's birthday party. Birthday celebrations, by the way, were a Greek tradition, not a Jewish one. This doesn't seem like a formal dinner, more like an orgy dominated by men. Herodias wasn't even there. But her daughter, whom we think was a young teenager named Salome, was. She performed before the guests, probably an erotic dance, and greatly pleased the guests and Antipas. Consequently, he impulsively offered her half his kingdom, which is a proverbial saying meaning anything you'd like. Herodias, working behind the scenes, saw to it that the request was the beheading of John the Baptist. Antipas was backed into a corner, and he could not go back on his public pledge, so he ordered the execution of John. Antipas certainly felt guilty about what he had done. He had yielded to public pressure and killed an innocent man, just like Pontius Pilate would do later. This likely explains Antipas's somewhat strange, superstitious reaction to hearing about Jesus. His first thought was one of dread. John the Baptist had come back to life to hold him accountable for his wrongdoing. Actually, no one around Herod Antipas would know much about Jesus, since Christ began his ministry after John was imprisoned. Thus, the impression in the royal court would not be that Jesus was John's contemporary, but that he was his successor. He would seem like someone who suddenly appeared after John's death. It was a Hellenistic myth that the dead would come back to haunt their killers, so hearing of a miracle worker in Galilee saying the same kinds of things as John would be frightening. Antipas lived a tragic life thereafter. Back when he decided to marry Herodias, he was already married at the time, for some 15 years, to a Nabatean princess. King Aretas IV of Nabatea was incensed when Antipas divorced his daughter. This played out on the battlefield with the Nabatean army defeating Antipas in AD 36. This was a humiliating defeat, and the Romans had to intervene. But Aretas had gotten his revenge against Antipas, and people considered this divine retribution against Antipas for killing John the Baptist. Herod was a tetrarch, but he had always wanted the title of king. Mark calls him king, but this is probably a popular, perhaps sarcastic title, not an official one. He was egged on by his ambitious wife Herodias to press the Romans for kingship, but this was denied and led to his official dismissal and banishment to Gaul by the Roman Emperor Caligula in AD 39. Taken together, our three stories today, Jesus rejected at Nazareth, Jesus sends out the 12 disciples, and the death of John the Baptist, are really a continuation of what Mark has been telling us all along. The power and authority of Jesus are now apparent. They have been displayed not for people's fascination or entertainment or critique, but for response. The many crowds that flocked to Jesus were largely people in need, and maybe their friends and curiosity seekers. They were those who sensed that they could in some way receive something from this man Jesus. The scribes and Pharisees, on the other hand, sensed that they could lose something to Jesus, perhaps their authority and position in the religious establishment. Jesus' family and fellow Nazarenes could not get past their familiarity with him. The disciples would go out and proclaim the good news only to find some with open doors and others with closed ears. Some, like Herodias, would seek to kill God's messengers. Everyone faces a fundamental existential question. It's not how do we find meaning or purpose or contentment in life. It's what do we do with Jesus?